Hello and welcome to our Oxford Analytica weekly video briefing. I'm Dr. Joe Ford and I'm joined by my colleague Dr. Chris Oates, North America analyst. The conflict in Syria continues to raise considerable diplomatic, strategic and geopolitical dilemmas and issues, in addition of course to the very profound consequences it has had, continues to have for that country and for its sub-region. Crucial to this issue is US foreign policy. And Chris, the first place to look when one's thinking about US foreign policy is often domestic politics. What was to happen in Congress, and really, who wants what in Washington?
Okay, well, that's a great question, and I think that's also a question that President Obama would love to know the answer to. Congress was going to vote on a resolution to authorize military force in Syria. It passed the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and then there was considerable opposition, and it has currently been postponed. I think the problem why there's been such uncertainty what was going to happen in Washington is that various groups want very different things, and they come from very different places on that. So I would say there's about 5 main groups. There's first the war hawks. These are represented most prominently by Senator John McCain and represent quite a few of the neoconservatives who are in control of the process leading up to the war in Iraq. They believe that the United States should intervene to spread democracy, to protect its interests, and generally they're more interventionist than any other domestic group. Then secondly, you have the liberal interventionists or the humanitarians. Now these are probably most publicly represented by the UN ambassador Samantha Power, who got her start covering the wars in the Balkans. Now, they believe that the United States should use its military power in order to protect civilians. It's the responsibility to protect doctrine. Because Bashar al-Assad has been killing his own civilians, or his forces have been, they believe that the United States should step in and protect those who are unable to protect themselves. Now, both those groups have wanted intervention in the Syrian conflict on the side of the rebels. And the United States has had diplomatic relations with the rebels, and that's basically been because of them. Now, opposing them, you have generally Democrats in Congress who are quite wary of any sort of military action as a way to achieve U.S. interests. Basically, they have been badly scarred by the war in Iraq, for which many of them voted, or against which many of them campaigned in getting to Congress. So they are instinctively wary about entering into the war in Syria. You also have Republicans who are either neo-isolationists. Rand Paul is probably the greatest example, who are strongly opposed to the neoconservative doctrine. And you also have Republicans who are simply opposed to President Obama. And you can look at their past statements, they've been all over the map on Syria. Their only constant is opposition to the president. And then the fifth faction, and this is what I believe is represented by the president, his closest advisors, and leaders of Congress, are those who are not interested in the Syrian civil war, but are interested in chemical weapons in Syria and in upholding the norm against chemical weapons use. So I think part of the problem with the debate in Washington is that you have President Obama saying it's going to be a limited strike, it won't involve the United States in the Syrian civil war, but he's announcing that next to Senator McCain, who for 2 years has been advocating U.S. entry. So it's been very difficult for Obama to separate, I believe, what he wants, which is a limited strike about chemical weapons, from what the rest of Congress is afraid might happen.
What about now the plan that's come forward in the last few days to sequester, to remove from the field, so to speak, Syria's chemical weapons through a UN-mandated process? How feasible is it, briefly, and how likely is it to happen?
It is feasible, but it is difficult, and it is not necessarily likely. This is a plan that John Kerry, Secretary of State, almost offhandedly mentioned.
That's right.
They had been talking about it for about a year, but there had been no movement. Immediately, though, the Russian foreign minister picked up on it, said that he is willing to do it. The United Nations said that they were willing to do it. The Syrian foreign minister said they were willing to go along with it. And so today, the Russian foreign minister and the U.S. Secretary of State are meeting in Geneva to discuss it. There are 4 main stages to this process, each one of which has potential obstacles. First is the political commitment. France is drafting a resolution at the UN Security Council which will likely include an authorization of the use of force if Syria backs out of this plan. Russia is very likely to oppose that. They may request that the U.S. promise not to intervene in Syria as a precondition for Assad to sign up to it. If that is accomplished, then Syria will have to declare all of their weapons stores and sign up to the Convention on the Prohibition of Use of Chemical Weapons. It's difficult mainly because it will be difficult for the rest of the world to believe what Assad is saying. There's really no way to verify other than sending inspectors in, which is the third stage. Now that's difficult because there's a civil war going on in Syria.
How do you move, transport,
absolutely,
etc. These weapons?
One of the reasons that Obama wants to have a norm against chemical weapons use is the fear that it's going to fall into the hands of terrorists.
So they're rather practical considerations.
Very practical. I mean, you're transporting chemical weapons in an area where Al-Qaeda has been operating, so that's going to be tricky. Then you have to destroy it. That's the fourth and final stage. Now, technically, this is can be difficult based on the type of chemical. There are mobile units, and then there's also the possibility to transport the weapons to Turkey or Jordan and then destroy them there. Now, each one of these steps, not only is it difficult technically, but it's also difficult to know whether Syria is fully complying.
Sure.
It's difficult to say that we can completely back off and stop watching Syria if they've got some in store and they may use them again. However, I think using them again is unlikely if they go to all this trouble and if President Obama has clearly demonstrated a willingness to military strikes if they're used again.
And that's the thrust of the brief today on that very matter.
Yeah.
I want to go back to where I started with US popular opinion, US domestic politics, and the role of popular opinion in that. There's been a lot of discussion that President Obama is trying to maneuver in the context of really a war-weary US public. Is that how you see things?
I think war-weary is probably not the correct term. I think war-cautious might be more accurate. It's absolutely true that the U.S. public is against an intervention in the Syrian civil war. But then again, that's not really what's at stake here. Or at least that's not what President Obama is trying to get at stake. What he's trying to do is a limited strike. I think the American public is very cautious about a limited strike turning into an involvement in the Syrian civil war. I think they're cautious about it turning into another Iraq or Afghanistan. But I also would argue against the thought that because they're not in favor, that they never will be in favor. I mean, just 2 years ago, the American public supported a campaign in Libya
where they saw a case.
Where a dictator who had been long a U.S. enemy was threatening to massacre an entire city. And the United States was not going to send soldiers into Libya, but was going to provide logistical support, and the public supported that. The public were dancing in the streets when the president sent a strike force into Pakistan to capture or kill Osama bin Laden. So I think if the situation changes and either Assad continues to use chemical weapons or he backs out, and if the president can convince the public that a limited strike will not turn into
intervention in the civil war,
as the hawks or the humanitarians might like, then I think public opinion could change. Not on the topic of intervention in the Syrian civil war, but on this particular strike package. So I think public opinion is a bit more malleable and flexible than many of the commentators have ascribed it to be.
Thanks very much, Chris. Next week is our annual conference. We'll be posting videos on the website directly from that conference, which will include discussion of some of these issues. Please join us then. Thank you.